The summer that changed my life began with a job I should have refused. That was the sentence I found myself repeating months later, trying to explain how something so ordinary could quietly rewrite everything I thought I knew about love, loyalty, and growing up. At 22, I believed my future was already mapped out. Graduate from architecture school, build a portfolio strong enough to impress a real firm, survive another year of ramen dinners and overdue utility bills, and maybe, if luck finally remembered my name, land a full-time position before student loans swallowed me alive. It wasn't glamorous, but it was honest. Then Ryan Brooks called me 3 days before Memorial Day weekend. We'd been best friends since 5th grade, the kind of friendship that survived different colleges, different girlfriends, and different dreams. His voice carried the excitement of someone standing at the edge of a new chapter. "I got the internship in Seattle," he said. 12 weeks. I leave Friday. I congratulated him without hesitation because he deserved it. Ryan had worked for that opportunity longer than anyone knew. But before hanging up, he hesitated. "Actually, Dad's looking for a summer assistant on a renovation project. Someone organized. Someone he can trust. I told him about you." I laughed before I realized he was serious. "Your dad? Daniel Brooks?" "Yeah." "The Daniel Brooks?" Ryan chuckled. "Believe it or not, he doesn't bite." I wasn't so sure. Daniel Brooks had always seemed larger than life. Even growing up, he wasn't like the other dads coaching Little League or grilling burgers on weekends. He was always leaving for business trips, taking calls that sounded impossibly important, or arriving at school events wearing tailored suits while everyone else's parents wore jeans. He wasn't unfriendly, just distant, composed, the kind of man who somehow made silence feel heavier than conversation. I hadn't seen him in nearly 4 years, not since Ryan's college send-off party. Life had pulled all of us in different directions after that. "He'll probably interview dozens of people," I said. Ryan laughed again. "Trust me, Dad hates interviewing people. If he invited you, it's because he already said yes." 2 days later, I stood outside Brooks' design group with my portfolio tucked under one arm and enough nerves to make my hands feel unsteady. The glass building reflected the bright June sunlight like polished water. Everything about it whispered precision, success, and impossible standards. The receptionist smiled warmly before leading me toward the top floor. "Mr. Brooks is waiting." Waiting. Not interviewing. Waiting. Somehow that made it worse. When the office doors opened, I saw him standing beside a wall of floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking downtown Chicago. Time had changed him, but only in the way mountains changed after seasons passed. His dark hair carried faint traces of silver near his temples, giving him an even steadier presence than I remembered. His white dress shirt was rolled neatly to his forearms, blueprints spread across the conference table beside him. He turned as I stepped inside, his calm gray eyes meeting mine with quiet recognition. For one long second, neither of us spoke. Then a small, genuine smile appeared. "Ethan Carter," he said evenly. "You've grown up." Before I could think of an answer, he extended his hand. "Welcome to the project. I trusted you because my son does." The first week settled into a rhythm that felt both comforting and strangely exhausting. Every morning I arrived at Brooks' Design Group a few minutes before 8, convinced that arriving early might somehow make me appear more competent. It never worked. Daniel Brooks was always there first. Sometimes he was studying blueprints spread across the conference table. Sometimes he stood quietly by the windows with a mug of black coffee, watching the city wake beneath a pale summer sky. Whatever time I arrived, he had already been working. It became impossible not to admire his discipline. He expected the same from everyone else. My responsibilities grew quickly. At first, I organized digital files, updated project schedules, and sorted through permits for a lakeside community center renovation 2 hours north of Chicago. Within days, he trusted me to revise preliminary sketches, attend client meetings, and accompany him during site inspections. He rarely offered compliments, but he never wasted words either. If he nodded once after reviewing my drawings, I learned that meant I had done well. If he quietly asked, "Can you make this stronger?" I understood there was something important I had overlooked. Oddly enough, I preferred his honesty over empty praise. One afternoon, we drove to the construction site in one of the firm's company trucks. The June sun reflected across Lake Michigan while workers measured foundations beneath temporary steel frames. Daniel handed me a hard hat before walking ahead without another word. I hurried to keep pace, notebook in hand, listening as he discussed structural changes with engineers and contractors. He never raised his voice. He did not have to. Everyone listened the moment he spoke because every sentence carried purpose. Watching him work reminded me that leadership was not about being the loudest person in the room. It was about making everyone else believe the project mattered as much as you did. During the drive back, silence filled the cab for several miles. I wondered if I should say something, but every conversation I imagined sounded awkward in my head. Finally, he broke the silence himself. "Ryan told me you almost changed your major sophomore year." I blinked in surprise. "He remembers that?" "He remembers more than you think." I smiled at the passing fields outside my window. I was burned out. I thought architecture might not be for me. "What changed?" he asked. I thought about the answer before speaking. I realized I never stopped loving buildings. I only stopped believing I belonged in the profession. He glanced at me briefly before returning his attention to the highway. "Those are not the same thing." His words stayed with me long after the conversation ended. They sounded simple, yet they carried the quiet certainty of someone who had once struggled with the same doubt. As the days passed, I began noticing details that Ryan had never mentioned. Daniel usually skipped lunch unless someone reminded him. His office lights remained on long after most employees left. Family photographs sat neatly arranged on a bookshelf, but none were recent. The newest picture of Ryan looked several years old. One evening, I stayed late to finish revised floor plans. The office had emptied, leaving only the hum of air conditioning and distant traffic drifting through the windows. I packed my laptop and walked past Daniel's office, expecting it to be dark. Instead, he sat alone at the conference table surrounded by drawings, his reading glasses resting lower on his nose as he carefully reviewed every page. For the first time, he looked less like the confident executive everyone admired and more like a man carrying responsibilities no one else could see. He noticed me standing there and offered a faint smile. "You should head home, Ethan. Tomorrow will come early." I returned the smile, nodded politely, and stepped into the quiet elevator, unaware that somewhere between the first handshake and that ordinary evening, my admiration had already begun changing into something I was not yet ready to name. The following Monday began with an unexpected change. As I walked into the office balancing a cardboard tray with my usual coffee, the receptionist smiled before I even reached the elevators. "Mr. Brooks already ordered yours this morning," she said, pointing toward the cup waiting neatly on the front desk. I looked down in confusion. I had never told Daniel what I drank. A small label on the side read Ethan, medium vanilla latte, extra shot. I frowned for a moment before realizing he must have noticed my order during one of our early morning meetings. It was such a small detail that most people would have forgotten within minutes, but somehow he had remembered. When I reached the conference room, he was already reviewing revised elevations for the community center. Without looking up, he simply said, "You looked tired on Friday." I thought the extra espresso might help. I thanked him quietly, unsure why such a simple gesture lingered in my thoughts longer than it should have. The project continued moving faster than either of us expected. Clients approved the revised concept, permits arrived ahead of schedule, and suddenly we found ourselves preparing for another series of site visits. Across northern Illinois, long hours in the truck became routine. Sometimes we drove for nearly 2 hours without saying much beyond discussing construction schedules and material costs. Surprisingly, the silence no longer felt uncomfortable. It felt peaceful. Daniel never seemed pressured to fill every quiet moment with conversation, and little by little I stopped feeling responsible for doing the same. One afternoon, heavy clouds rolled across the sky while we inspected the lakeside property. The weather shifted within minutes, and rain began falling in wide silver sheets across the shoreline. The construction crew hurried toward temporary shelters while Daniel and I gathered rolled blueprints before they could get soaked. We reached the truck laughing under our breath at how quickly the weather had turned. It was the first time I had ever heard him laugh without restraint. It was quieter than Ryan's, deeper, almost surprised, as though he had forgotten what laughing freely sounded like. As the rain drummed softly against the windshield, neither of us rushed to start driving. We simply watched the lake disappear behind curtains of summer rain. "Ryan always hated storms," Daniel said suddenly. "He used to climb into my bed every time the thunder started." I smiled. "He still hates them." Daniel chuckled. "Some things never change." I looked toward him. He talks about you all the time, you know. Daniel raised an eyebrow. Only the good stories, I hope. Mostly. That earned another genuine smile. It changed his entire face. The lines of responsibility softened, making him seem years younger than the image everyone in the office carried of the untouchable company president. On the drive home, we stopped at a small roadside diner because the rain had flooded part of the highway. The place smelled of fresh coffee and homemade pie. Families filled the booths while an old country song played quietly through worn-ceiling speakers. Daniel ordered grilled chicken and vegetables. I ordered a cheeseburger with fries, then immediately apologized for choosing something unhealthy. He looked at me with mild amusement. You are 22. If anyone has earned fries, it is probably you. I laughed harder than the joke deserved. Dinner drifted away from architecture for the first time. We talked about favorite baseball games, road trips Ryan had convinced us to take years apart without realizing it, books we both secretly enjoyed, and how neither of us could keep houseplants alive for more than a month. The conversations felt effortless, almost strangely familiar, as though we had skipped years we never actually shared. When we finally arrived back in Chicago after sunset, Daniel parked outside my apartment building instead of simply dropping me at the curb. Good work today, he said before I stepped out. There was no speech, no elaborate compliment, just 4 quiet words spoken with complete sincerity. As I climbed the stairs to my apartment, I caught myself smiling for reasons I could not fully explain. Somewhere between shared coffee, unexpected laughter, and a rainy afternoon beside the lake, Daniel Brooks had quietly stopped feeling like my best friend's father and started feeling like someone I looked forward to seeing every single morning. By the middle of July, the project no longer felt like a temporary assignment. It felt like a routine that quietly shaped every part of my week. I knew exactly how Daniel liked meeting notes organized, which suppliers preferred phone calls over emails, and how he always paused for a few seconds before making an important decision. In return, he somehow learned my habits just as naturally. He knew I concentrated better with instrumental music playing softly through my headphones. He noticed when I skipped lunch because I was too focused on a deadline. More than once, a sandwich appeared on my desk with nothing more than a brief note that read, "Do not forget to eat." There was never a signature. There did not need to be one. One Friday afternoon, we finished a client presentation earlier than expected. The office slowly emptied as employees welcomed another summer weekend, but Daniel remained in his office reviewing financial reports. I packed my laptop, ready to leave, when he looked up. "Do you have plans tonight?" The question caught me off guard. "Nothing important," I admitted. "Why?" He hesitated for only a moment. "Would you mind helping me look over a few renovation ideas at the house? It is easier to visualize them there." I agreed before overthinking the invitation. His home stood along a quiet, tree-lined street north of the city, elegant without feeling extravagant. It looked lived in rather than displayed. Inside, warm wooden floors replaced polished marble, family photographs filled the shelves, and shelves of architecture books shared space with old baseball trophies that clearly belonged to Ryan. The house felt surprisingly personal, nothing like the perfectly controlled image Daniel projected at work. We spread blueprints across the dining table, discussing room layouts while late afternoon sunlight filtered through large windows overlooking the backyard. Somewhere between measuring wall dimensions and debating natural lighting, the conversation drifted away from architecture. My eyes stopped on a framed photograph sitting near the fireplace. Ryan looked about 12 years old, grinning beside a younger Daniel wearing jeans instead of tailored suits. Between them stood a woman with bright eyes and an easy smile. Daniel noticed where I was looking. His expression softened almost immediately. "That was taken in Colorado," he said quietly. Ryan insisted we climb a trail that was much steeper than the brochure suggested. I smiled at the picture. "You all look happy." He remained silent for several seconds before answering. "We were." There was no bitterness in his voice, only honesty. I waited, giving him room to stop if he wanted. Instead, he continued. "Ryan's mother and I realized we were better parents than partners. The divorce was peaceful, but peaceful does not always mean painless." He looked toward the window instead of at me. The hardest part was wondering whether Ryan believed it was somehow his fault. I understood that fear more than he realized. "He never has," I said gently. "He talks about both of you with so much respect." I think what stayed with him was not the divorce. It was the fact that neither of you ever made him choose. Daniel lowered his eyes, And for the first time since I had known him, I saw unmistakable relief cross his face. It was subtle, almost invisible, but it was there. "Thank you," he said quietly. "I do not think anyone has ever told me that." The room fell comfortably silent. Outside, the golden light of early evening stretched across the backyard, painting long shadows over the grass. Daniel poured 2 glasses of iced tea before sitting across from me again. "What about you?" he asked. "What do you want after graduation?" I looked down at the sketches spread across the table. "I want to design places where people actually feel at home. Buildings that matter to ordinary families instead of just looking impressive in magazines." A faint smile appeared on his face. "That is the first answer I have heard in years that was not about money or awards." He studied me for another quiet moment before speaking again. "Do not lose that." Those 3 words settled somewhere deep inside me. As the sun disappeared beyond the trees, and we returned to reviewing the plans, I realized the project was no longer the only reason I looked forward to each new day. Without either of us noticing exactly when it happened, 2 people from completely different generations had begun sharing something far more meaningful than blueprints. We had started trusting each other with the parts of ourselves that no professional resume could ever describe. The final phase of the project required us to spend nearly an entire week visiting smaller towns along the Wisconsin border, meeting local officials, and inspecting community spaces that would influence the final design. Instead of driving back to Chicago every evening, Daniel reserved 2 rooms at a quiet lakeside overlooking a peaceful stretch of water surrounded by tall pine trees. It was the kind of place families returned to every summer, where the front porch held weathered rocking chairs and the owner greeted every guest by name. The slower pace felt strangely refreshing after weeks of conference rooms and construction sites. During the day, we walked through libraries, recreation centers, and neighborhood parks, taking notes on how people naturally used public spaces. Daniel observed everything. He noticed where elderly couples preferred to sit, how children instinctively gathered under the largest trees for shade, and why parents always chose benches with clear views of the playground. Watching him reminded me that great architecture was never about impressive buildings alone. It was about understanding the people who would fill them with life. One afternoon, our final meeting ended much earlier than expected, leaving several unexpected hours before sunset. As we packed our notebooks into the truck, Daniel looked toward the lake shimmering beneath the warm July sky. "We have not taken a real break in weeks," he said. "Would you like to walk before dinner?" I smiled without hesitation. I would. The trail curved gently along the shoreline, shaded by towering oaks that filtered the golden sunlight into dancing patterns across the path. Families rented kayaks nearby while children skipped stones across the calm water. Somewhere farther down the shore, someone played an acoustic guitar softly enough that the music blended naturally with the breeze. We walked without rushing, talking about everything except work. Daniel admitted he had once wanted to become a history teacher before discovering architecture. I confessed that I secretly carried a sketchbook everywhere because drawing buildings by hand still made me happier than using computer software. He laughed and admitted he still preferred sharpened pencils over digital tablets whenever inspiration struck unexpectedly. We stopped at a small ice cream stand overlooking the marina. When it was my turn to order, I reached for my wallet, but Daniel quietly handed the cashier his card before I could protest. "Consider it payment for surviving my schedule," he said with a faint smile. We carried our cones toward a wooden dock extending into the lake. For several quiet minutes, we simply watched sailboats drifting across the water beneath a sky slowly turning shades of orange and pink. "Ryan used to insist on racing the ducks every summer," Daniel said with an amused shake of his head. I laughed. "That sounds exactly like him." "He never won," Daniel replied. "But he celebrated every finish as though he had." We both laughed. Together, the easy sound carried away by the evening breeze. As the laughter faded, a peaceful silence settled between us again. It no longer felt like the silence between an employer and an assistant. It felt like the kind shared by 2 people who no longer needed constant conversation to enjoy each other's company. Daniel looked out across the water before speaking quietly. "This has been the easiest summer I have had in a very long time." His words caught me off guard because I had been thinking the exact same thing. "Mine too," I admitted. He turned toward me with an expression I could not quite read. There was warmth in his eyes, but also hesitation, as though he had almost said something else before deciding against it. At that exact moment, my phone vibrated inside my pocket. Ryan's name appeared across the screen. I answered immediately, smiling as he launched into stories about Seattle, new coworkers, and endless rainy mornings. Daniel listened quietly while I laughed, occasionally glancing toward the lake instead of interrupting. After I hung up, neither of us spoke for several moments. The mention of Ryan had gently reminded us of the invisible line that had quietly followed us throughout the entire summer. We stood together watching the last rays of sunlight disappear beyond the horizon, both aware that something between us had changed, and both equally determined not to be the first person to give those unspoken feelings a name. When we returned to Chicago, everything looked exactly the same, yet nothing felt the same anymore. The familiar skyline greeted us beneath a bright August morning. Traffic moved with its usual urgency, and Brooks' design group buzzed with conversations about deadlines and client meetings. On the surface, our routine continued without interruption. Beneath that routine, however, something had shifted so quietly that neither of us knew how to pretend it had not happened. Daniel became more reserved almost overnight. He was never cold, never impatient, but the effortless conversations we had shared during long drives slowly disappeared. Meetings ended the moment business was finished. Lunch breaks happened separately. If I entered his office, he smiled politely before returning his attention to whatever document lay on his desk. It was subtle enough that no one else would have noticed, but I noticed every single change. At first, I convinced myself he was simply overwhelmed by the final stage of the project. Then I began wondering whether I had unknowingly crossed some invisible line. I replayed every conversation from the past few weeks, searching for something I might have said wrong. The more I searched, the less I understood. One afternoon, I knocked on his office door, carrying revised presentation boards for the final client review. He thanked me, studied the drawings carefully, and nodded with quiet approval. Normally, that would have led to another discussion about design choices or construction details. Instead, he closed the folder gently and said, "Excellent work, Ethan. That will be all for today." I stood there for a second longer than necessary, hoping he might say something else. He did not. I left his office carrying a disappointment that felt strangely personal. Later that evening, I remained in the studio long after everyone else had gone home, trying to distract myself by organizing digital files that did not actually need organizing. Around 8 o'clock, I heard footsteps behind me. Daniel stood beside my desk with his suit jacket folded over one arm. "You should not still be here," he said quietly. I forced a small smile. "Neither should you." He almost smiled back before looking away toward the dark windows overlooking the city. Sometimes work is easier than going home. The honesty of that sentence surprised both of us. For a brief moment, the familiar connection returned. I wanted to ask why. I wanted to ask whether something had changed between us. Instead, I simply nodded because I sensed he was carrying thoughts he had not yet figured out how to explain. We walked toward the elevator together in comfortable silence, but it felt different now. Not empty. Careful. As the elevator descended, he finally spoke without looking at me. "Ryan called earlier." My heart tightened immediately. "Is everything all right?" "Yes. His internship is ending next week. He will be home soon." The words hung quietly between us. Home soon. Suddenly, the summer no longer felt endless. It had an ending, and that ending was approaching much faster than either of us wanted to admit. When the elevator reached the lobby, we stepped outside into the warm evening air. The city glowed beneath strings of lights as people hurried toward restaurants, concerts, and late summer celebrations. Daniel stopped beside his car, but did not unlock the door right away. "Ethan," he said softly, "there are moments in life when doing the right thing feels much harder than doing what makes us happy." I looked at him, confused by the sadness behind his calm expression. "What do you mean?" He hesitated, his gray eyes meeting mine for only a heartbeat before drifting away again. "Nothing," he answered with a quiet shake of his head. "Forget I said that." He wished me a good night and drove away before I could respond. I stood alone beneath the streetlights, watching his taillights disappear into the evening traffic, carrying home more questions than answers. For the first time since accepting the summer position, I realized the greatest obstacle between us had never been age, distance, or circumstance. It was the quiet conviction inside Daniel Brooks that caring too deeply for the person standing in front of him might cost him the trust of the son he loved more than anything else. Ryan came home on the first Saturday in August carrying the same easy smile he had worn since we were kids. He hugged me the moment he spotted me outside the airport, talking so quickly about Seattle that I barely had time to answer before he had already started another story. It felt comforting, familiar, and strangely bittersweet. During the drive back into the city, he thanked me at least 5 different times for helping his father over the summer. "Seriously, Ethan," he said, shaking his head with a grin. "Dad actually sounds happier." I have not heard him laugh that much in years. I forced a smile while keeping my eyes on the highway. "We just worked well together." Ryan studied me for a brief second before nodding. "Whatever you did, thank you." I was worried he would spend another summer living inside that office. That evening, Daniel invited both of us to dinner at his house to celebrate Ryan's return. The familiar dining room looked exactly as I remembered, yet the atmosphere felt completely different. Ryan filled every quiet moment with stories about hiking trails, new friends, and impossible deadlines while Daniel listened with unmistakable pride. I found myself watching the exchange more than participating in it. There was something deeply moving about seeing the reserved man I had come to know become simply a father enjoying his son's company. More than once our eyes met across the table, and each time Daniel looked away almost immediately. His distance hurt more than I wanted to admit. After dinner, Ryan disappeared upstairs to unpack another suitcase, leaving Daniel and me alone in the kitchen. We quietly gathered empty plates without speaking. The silence stretched until Daniel finally said, "Thank you for everything you did this summer." His voice sounded formal again, almost like the first day I had walked into his office. I nodded without meeting his eyes. "You do not have to thank me." "I do." He hesitated before continuing. "Monday will be your last official day with the firm." Hearing the words spoken aloud made the ending feel painfully real. "I know," I answered softly. Neither of us found anything else to say before Ryan came back downstairs, cheerful and completely unaware of the emotions quietly filling the room. Over the next 2 days, I noticed Ryan watching us more carefully. It was not suspicion. It was curiosity. During lunch on Monday, he smiled and said, "You two have become weirdly quiet around each other. At the beginning of the summer, you could barely stop talking about blueprints." Daniel calmly reached for his coffee while I laughed a little too quickly. "We finally ran out of architecture jokes." Ryan chuckled, but I could tell he was not completely convinced. That afternoon, the project officially concluded with the final client presentation. The community center proposal received unanimous approval, and the entire office applauded after months of work finally reached its conclusion. Everyone congratulated one another before slowly returning to their desks. As employees drifted away, I gathered my portfolio and prepared to leave Daniel's office for what I believed would be the last time. Before I reached the door, Ryan appeared unexpectedly, holding 2 framed photographs he had found while cleaning a storage cabinet. One picture showed us as 10-year-old boys covered in mud after losing a Little League championship. The other showed Daniel standing between us at a family barbecue, smiling with an expression that looked far younger than I remembered. Ryan laughed as he handed one frame to each of us. "Funny," he said quietly. "Looking at these, I realized something during my flight home." Daniel looked up. "What is that?" Ryan's smile slowly faded into thoughtful honesty. "The 2 people I care about most spent an entire summer pretending they were only talking about work." The room became completely silent. Ryan took a slow breath before continuing. "I am not disappointed because something changed between you. I am disappointed because neither of you trusted me enough to be honest with yourselves." His words settled gently rather than painfully, leaving no anger behind them, only understanding. For the first time all summer, the truth stood quietly in the room, no longer hidden by blueprints, deadlines, or careful silence. Ryan's words remained with me long after I left the office that evening. I drove home through quiet Chicago streets without turning on the radio, replaying every conversation from the summer in my mind. I had spent weeks convincing myself that keeping my feelings hidden was the responsible thing to do, but for the first time I questioned whether silence had actually protected anyone. The next morning I woke early out of habit, even though my internship had officially ended. Around 9 o'clock, my phone rang. Daniel's name appeared on the screen. My heartbeat quickened before I answered. "Good morning," I said. There was a brief pause before his familiar calm voice came through. Would you be willing to meet me? Of course. The Lakeside Community Center. Around noon. I will be there. He thanked me quietly before ending the call. 2 hours later, I stood outside the nearly completed building where our project had begun to feel like something much more personal. Construction crews had finished most of the exterior, and the wide glass windows reflected the bright August sky. The lake beyond the property shimmered beneath a warm breeze, looking almost exactly as it had during our first site visit months earlier. Daniel was already there, standing alone near the wooden boardwalk with his hands in his pockets. As I walked toward him, I noticed he looked different. Not older or more tired. Simply lighter, as though he had finally decided to stop carrying something alone. For several moments, neither of us spoke. We simply looked across the water together. Finally, he broke the silence. Ryan and I talked for nearly 3 hours after you left. I turned toward him, but said nothing. He reminded me that I spent his entire childhood teaching him one lesson. Daniel smiled faintly. That honesty matters more than comfort. He let out a quiet breath before continuing. Somewhere along the way, I forgot to follow my own advice. I listened carefully, allowing him to choose every word at his own pace. When I hired you, I believed I was giving my son's best friend an opportunity. His eyes remained fixed on the lake. I never expected to look forward to every meeting, every drive, every conversation. I kept telling myself those feelings would disappear once summer ended. He shook his head gently. Instead, they only became harder to ignore. My heart pounded so loudly that I wondered if he could hear it. I tried creating distance because I believed that was the right thing to do, he continued. Not because I stopped caring, but because I cared far too much. I finally found my voice. I thought I had done something wrong. Daniel looked at me with unmistakable regret. No, Ethan. The only mistake was believing I had to face those feelings alone. We stood quietly for another moment while a gentle breeze rippled across the lake. Ryan surprised me, he admitted with a small laugh. Instead of asking whether I cared about you, he asked whether I respected you. Daniel met my eyes fully for the first time. In weeks. The answer was immediate. I respect your character, your kindness, your integrity, everything that made this summer unforgettable. I felt my own fears slowly dissolving. He told me something too, I said softly. He said happiness is difficult to recognize if everyone keeps pretending. Daniel smiled, and this time it reached his eyes completely. My son has become wiser than I realized. He took one careful step closer, leaving enough space that the gesture felt thoughtful rather than impulsive. I cannot change our ages. I cannot change how we met, but I can choose to be honest. His expression remained calm, steady, and sincere. If you ever decide there could be a future worth exploring together, I would like the chance to discover it honestly, patiently, and with Ryan's blessing rather than anyone's secrecy. I smiled through emotions I could no longer hide. I would like that too. For the first time since the summer had begun, neither of us felt the need to look away. 1 year later, the ribbon stretched across the entrance of the completed Lakeside Community Center shimmered beneath another bright August sky. Children raced across the freshly landscaped courtyard, while neighbors gathered beneath colorful banners celebrating the building's grand opening. Watching families laugh together inside a place that had once existed only as lines on blueprints filled me with a quiet sense of pride that no award could ever replace. I stood near the entrance adjusting my tie, still unable to believe how much life had changed in 12 short months. After graduating from architecture school, I accepted a full-time position with Brooks Design Group. Daniel never treated me differently from any other architect on the team. Every project, every promotion, and every responsibility had to be earned. Looking back, I appreciated that more than I could ever explain. Respect had always mattered more to him than appearances, and because of that, I became a better architect than I had imagined possible. Our relationship had grown just as carefully. There had been no dramatic announcements, no reckless decisions, and no shortcuts. We allowed trust to grow at its own pace, built on honest conversations, mutual respect, and the quiet certainty that neither of us wanted to rush something worth protecting. Ryan remained exactly what he had always been, my best friend. If anything, our friendship became even stronger. Occasionally, he still teased us during family dinners, usually reminding everyone that he expected free design advice for his future house because he had technically introduced us. Daniel always rolled his eyes while I laughed, and somehow those ordinary moments became my favorite memories. As the ceremony prepared to begin, the mayor stepped onto the small outdoor stage to thank everyone who had contributed to the project. When my name and Daniel's were mentioned together, the audience applauded warmly. I glanced toward him instinctively. He smiled with quiet pride, not because people were applauding us, but because the building behind us would soon belong to the community we had spent months trying to understand. After the speeches ended, families wandered through the finished spaces for the first time. Children filled the reading corner inside the library, teenagers gathered around the art studio, and older couples admired the sunlit walking paths overlooking the lake. Every room carried echoes of conversations we had shared during long drives, rainy afternoons, and evenings spent revising sketches across his dining table. I realized then that every meaningful building contains invisible stories hidden beneath concrete and glass. Ours simply happened to include two people who had found each other while designing a place for everyone else. As the afternoon slowly turned toward evening, the crowd began drifting home. Ryan volunteered to help the staff finish cleaning, while Daniel and I stepped outside onto the same wooden boardwalk where we had once admitted feelings we were both afraid to name. The lake looked unchanged, reflecting streaks of gold across the calm water exactly as it had the summer before. Daniel leaned against the railing beside me and smiled. "Do you remember the first thing I ever said to you?" I laughed softly. "You told me you trusted me because your son did." He nodded. "I thought I was offering someone a summer job." He looked across the water before continuing. "I did not realize I was meeting the person who would make every season afterward feel like home." I reached for his hand, and this time there was no uncertainty, no hesitation, and nothing left to hide. The evening breeze carried the laughter of families across the lake, while the lights inside the community center slowly came to life, welcoming another generation through doors we had once imagined together. Standing there beside Daniel, I finally understood that the most meaningful structures are never built from steel, wood, or stone alone. They are built from trust, patience, kindness, and the courage to tell the truth at exactly the right moment. Looking back now, I no longer remember that summer as the season when I accepted an unexpected job. I remember it as the season when two lives, built on different timelines, quietly found the same future.